Good afternoon. I'm John Ragasta, a historian here at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. And we're so glad you could join us this afternoon for a conversation between Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry will be portrayed by Richard Schumann, who portrays Patrick Henry at Colonial Williamsburg. And Bill Barker, our own Bill Barker, portrays Thomas Jefferson here at Monticello. Gentlemen, we would like to have a civil discussion today about how you met and some of your experiences. Perhaps if you can have a seat, and I will leave you the floor and ask a few questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ragasta. Did you hear that, Colonel Henry? A civil discussion.
I heard.
Well, then please take a chair. It's my house.
Gentlemen, begin by asking how you first met each other.
No, recall distinctly. It was Christmas in 59 or 60, somewhere there. You were just about to wend your way to attend the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg City. And I remember distinctly it was at the home of Nat Dandridge, who at the time was an old boyhood chum of mine, who since that time became my father-in-law. There's a story in that too.
Yes, it was Christmastide. And in fact, it was at Nat Dandridge's house, Mrs. Washington's brother. And if I recall, I was there about a fortnight. And I must admit, Colonel, you regaled all of the people there in your repertoire upon the fiddle. Oh, I was no less enthralled with your artistry. And well, before I took leave, I ventured up to you. And at the time, I was still not too comfortable in society.
Yes,
I stuttered a bit. And so I asked where I might begin lessons. And of course, in your stentorian fashion, you said, well, Master Jefferson, head straight to Williamsburg and there purchase a fiddle of the music makers and begin your lessons with Signor Francis Alberti. He was the governor's own at the time.
Aye.
And then you said, and you will find, young Jefferson, that the fiddle will allow you an introduction to many a lovely young lady. Well, I will tell you this, I don't think there was a stutter because I immediately took leave, head straight to Williamsburg, purchased a violin from the music makers, began my lessons with Signor Alberti. And within about, I venture, 3 years, practicing several hours a day, I became well known as one of the finest violinists in all of Virginia.
And did Mr. Jefferson ever thank me for that cordial advice I gave to him? Indeed, which I believe had much to do with his eventual marriage to his lovely wife? No, not even now, as we sit here together after all these years.
Perhaps, Mr. Henry, Mr. Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson, when you went to Williamsburg, Mr. Henry was your senior in politics and public life. He was already in the House of Burgesses. Did you see him in that political capacity?
Well, first and foremost, Dr. Ragasta, you're quite right. Colonel Henry will forever be my elder. And so, by all means, I did have the opportunity to bear witness, I will admit, bear witness to your extraordinary talent in oration. In fact, Colonel, I will tell you flat out, I was captivated by it. I will tell you all, I will never forget the occasion when, as a young man, I was reading law with Mr. George Wythe. This was in March 1765.
The time of the Stamp Act.
We were interrupted in our studies by someone who said, gentlemen, you must come down to the House of Burgesses now and bear witness to Henry's extraordinary powers of oration. You must not miss it. And I will admit, I made my way straight away and there to the entrance hall of the House of Burgesses, though very crowded, far too many people, both within and without. As I came into the portals of the assembly room, there you were, Colonel, there you were, and I arrived just at the moment when you referred to history. Now, Colonel, that has ever remained a great interest between both you and myself. You were speaking about, well, let me see if I recall. Lest we forget, Julius Caesar had his Brutus, they answered, yes. And Charles I had his Cromwell, yes. And then you proceeded and made his majesty and cries of treason. Treason, treason erupted amongst all of the Burgesses. You seized the moment, just as Speaker Robinson was asking you to be seated. You seized the moment and you apologized. You apologized to all of the Burgesses assembled. You apologized to the king. And as you were about ready to be seated, you said, if this be treason, make the most of it?
Aye, as I recall, yes.
Well, some say you said, so be it. Well, was it make the most of it? So be it.
I don't know. I don't write down my various orations, Mr. Jefferson. You know that. I speak extempore from my mother wit. But I do recall that that particular section that Mr. Jefferson referred to had to do with the fifth resolution of the 7 of the Stamp Act resolutions I had presented. It passed by only 1 vote. And I learned later from Mr. Jefferson himself, who was standing in the lobby at the time. Again, he was not yet a member of the House. But he told me that after the vote, Peyton Randolph himself stormed past him, exclaiming, "By God, I'd give 500 guineas for a single vote this day." I knew there was no point in introducing 6 and 7.
And I wrote down that evening, Colonel, this day I heard Henry speak, just as Homer wrote.
Well, Mr. Henry, later you and Mr. Jefferson did have the opportunity to serve together in the House of Burgesses as the Revolution approached. Perhaps you could tell us a little about how you worked together.
Generally speaking, as I recall, there was a small circle of men who had the greatest to do with causing trouble to His Majesty George III and the government of Great Britain. Mr. Jefferson and I were both among that small circle of men, along with 2 of the brothers Lee, Richard Henry Lee, and his brother Frank. Your cousin, Dabney Carr, until he passed on so tragically in 73. Colonel George Mason of Fairfax County. It was that small group of men that was generally conspiring, oftentimes after hours. I distinctly remember one late night in the Capitol building in old Williamsburg, where we gathered together and hit upon the idea of a day of fasting and prayer to show our support and our sympathy for those distressed souls in Boston whose port was about to be closed up. Mr. Jefferson, in fact, was essential in coming up with that particular plan.
I believe, as I had termed it, we cooked up the resolution. I think we referred to certain precedents in English law that would allow us that opportunity to protest in a civil fashion.
Well, gentlemen, that proclamation raises another question. You both were born and raised in the Church of England, but in your time in Williamsburg, we began to see many, many dissenters from the Church of England, and religious freedom changed over the Revolution. Might you talk a little bit about the dissenters and religious freedom?
Certainly. Even after all these years, I shall remain loyal to my father's church, what we now call, since independence, the Protestant Episcopal Church. But my mother and all of my 7 sisters, both of my wives, one deceased and one currently living, all have embraced the Presbyterian faith. As a young boy, I too were taken to hear the sermons of some of those great dissenting preachers. In fact, I still hold that the Reverend Samuel Davies is the greatest orator I ever heard, a Presbyterian. I was proud as a young attorney, when I was still riding the county circuit, to represent a number of itinerant Baptist preachers, seeing to their releases from the confines of closed prison, oftentimes paying their jail costs and their court costs myself, anonymously. So it is not so much which particular denomination to me that one worships under, it's that one worships in the Christian faith. I firmly believe that we must be a moral and virtuous people. Elsewise, this republic will not be a successful experiment. And in order to do that, we must have frequent and constant reinforcement of the gospel of Jesus.
Colonel Henry is quite correct. The 2 of us were allied in support of the dissenters that came in, more and more coming into the old colony of Virginia in the late 1760s than I think we had borne witness before. And all of the petitions being put forth, not only by the by the Presbyterians, Quaker men as well, but most importantly, the Baptists, which you have just referred. And so many that the House of Burgesses created a committee for religion.
Upon which we both served.
Yes, we did, to hear the great and growing number of petitions. And of course, remember, as the colonel was saying, he was vestryman of the Church of England at the time, his father before him. Well, so was I, and my father before me. And I, nonetheless, in support of creating the American Episcopal Church here in Virginia. And you see, we were all governed by the Church of England as we were governed by the monarchy. We had to pay a tax to the support of the Church of England at that time. And if you desisted, you were fined. And if you failed to pay your fine, you were thrown in jail. Henry, do you remember the number of jails in Virginia overflowing with Baptists who were hurled therein? And so it was that the Committee for Religion was of great influence as the war began and we severed our ties with Great Britain, let alone severed our ties with the Church of England, and thereby allowed for true freedom for religion to emanate and to allow all, be they Baptist, Presbyterian, Quaker men, old Anglicans who still adhered to that tradition, but also Catholics and Hebrews, all of various religious opinions, to be entirely free to carry their communion with their Maker as they choose. And hence, of course, our Statute of Virginia for religious freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Gentlemen, you both are very religious men in your own way, having very different views, I understand, but religious in your own way. Perhaps then you might comment on the fact that you are also both slaveholders and how one can be a religious person and a slaveholder.
I have long believed that with my devout Christian faith, the practice of owning slaves is inconsistent with that which I find in the Holy Writ. The system of slavery is repugnant to the first impression of right and wrong, and what adds to my amazement is that it was introduced into this country in the first place. This being more, and during these enlightened ages too, which seem at least to boast of high improvements made in not only the arts and sciences, but of refined morality. Every honest thinking man must reject the system of slavery in speculation, but alas, how few in practice. Would anyone believe that I am myself the master of slaves of my own purchase? It is with considerable shame that I confess to you, sir, that I am drawn along to the practice of owning slaves by the general inconvenience of living without them. For my own part, I cannot justify it, and I will not.
Henry, you've spoken honestly and most direct. Indeed, you are a very successful man. You have grown great estate. And I think you well understand that I myself am an inheritor of vast land bequeathed to me by my late father, and the inheritor of the families that have resided upon that land. I agree with you that anyone in their right mind cannot possibly draw the laws of nature and nature's God into a conclusion that everyone is born free and then admit that slavery is just or right. It is not. For God is a just God. He cannot but abhor the institution of slavery. And we have spoken well. When do we begin to tremble in recognition his justice will not sleep forever? And nothing more assuredly written in the book of fate than these people ought to be free. And yet, by habit and custom, and by many laws, we are still held tightly in this barbarous institution. And I now the more so, being so deeply in debt. I make no excuses, as you well understand. I make no excuses. History is going to be hard on us. It's going to be hard on me, having been the author of our Declaration of American Independence. But let our declaration be a beacon light of what we can jointly pursue together to rectify these inconsistencies amongst the laws of man with a respect to the laws of nature.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, you mentioned the Declaration of Independence. Perhaps we might come back to the Revolution. You, of course, the author of the Declaration, Mr. Henry, you were very much involved in the 1776 Virginia Constitution and then became the first governor under the Virginia Constitution for 3 years, followed by Mr. Jefferson as governor for 2 years. But that brings us to 1781, when after the British invasion of Virginia and the government fleeing from Richmond, there was an investigation of Mr. Jefferson's governorship, suggested that he did not adequately defend the nation. And some say, Mr. Henry, that you were responsible for that investigation.
Nonsense. It is true I gave my vote in favor of having that inquiry into the conduct of the chief executive. We didn't even name him by name. It was introduced by George Nicholas, who's the son of our treasurer. There are those men, and Nicholas obviously was one of them, who want to find someone to blame for what looks like our imminent ruin. The measure was seconded by Archie Carey and put to the vote, and everyone, almost everyone, including myself, yes, gave our votes in favor of having this investigation the next time the legislature met. Now, mark you, we had our different reasons for voting in the affirmative. Mr. Jefferson's friends, of which I have considered myself one since the time he was but a lad of 17, wanted to learn from past mistakes so that they weren't repeated and to clear his good name. Oh, he was being dragged through the mud by a number of men in those days. The word cowardice and Jefferson were synonymous one with another. And then they were his enemies who wanted to ruin him. I was not of that number. I reject that. That's nonsense.
Nonsense indeed, Colonel. I would like to know, standing here right in front of you. You speak of Nicholas, and I will agree. Yes, I heard of the machinations of George Nicholas hurling forth this suggestion. Were you not seated next to him in the reconvening of the assembly in Stanton? Did you not perhaps give him a little nudge to encourage, incite such an investigation? Oh, it is said, Henry, because yes, not all were there.
Mr. Henry, I know that this is a painful topic for you, Mr. Jefferson, but perhaps we could turn to a topic that's more congenial. If you could have a seat.
I'm all for congeniality, Dr. Augusta. Thank you.
Let's turn away from the 1781 investigation. I know that it pained Mr. Jefferson some time thereafter, but in the 1780s, you both were about your business for the government. Mr. Henry, you in Richmond, Mr. Jefferson, you in Paris, but were deeply concerned for the new government. And when the new Constitution was proposed out of Philadelphia in 1787, you both had serious concerns with that Constitution. Perhaps you could tell us why.
In fact, if you would allow, Colonel, did I not hear, it was sent to me through correspondence, that when you learned of the Constitutional Convention convening in Philadelphia that September 87, that you refused to go because I think the term you used, I smell a rat.
Well, I certainly did suspect that there was some mischief afoot in Philadelphia. And I did not go to represent Virginia at the Constitutional Convention. My health was not well at the time. I suffered really since the time of the Revolution in terms of my physical being. But I wanted to save my strength for where I believed it would matter the most. And that is when the Constitution came here to Virginia for ratification. You are quite correct, sir, that I did dominate the anti-federalist position in the Richmond Town debates in June of 1788, speaking almost all of 17 of the 23 days that the debates were in session. So I found fault with the entire part of the document, but that which worried me most, and I believe I had some support in this particular matter from Mr. Jefferson, who was in France at the time. The Constitution was lacking something that I believe to be absolutely essential for a free people. I speak of a Bill of Rights. Madison and his creatures should have known better when they were drafting that document, because we did things the proper way in Williamsburg back in 1776. First, we drafted a Bill of Rights, and then we formed a constitution to protect and secure those rights. In Philadelphia, however, a constitution, no Bill of Rights, and they had the nerve to tell us that a Bill of Rights was not necessary. Oh, what if we forget one or two, Mr. Henry? That will naturally surrender those individual liberties over to the power of the federal government forever. We can't have that. And then finally, we could just, I'll tell you what, Mr. Henry, ratify the Constitution now, and we'll give you a Bill of Rights later. We promise. You may call me old-fashioned, friends, or you may call me suspicious. But when it comes to being suspicious of politicians making promises, I consider suspicion to be a very great virtue indeed.
Colonel Henry is wont to speak the truth, that many of us, having become familiar with the Virginia Declaration of Rights, want to recognize those inalienable rights that are given to us, that are given to the family of man, not by any government, not by any ruler, that are given to mankind by nature and nature's God. And this to, of course, precede the Constitution of the new Commonwealth of Virginia. I was of the same mind, though several thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. I believed that the Articles of Confederation were a venerable fabric, that all of the new states and commonwealths could work together. And though mindful, Henry, you must admit, there was no cohesive method of a general system of taxation for the national defense. There was no efficient method for electing the chief magistrate, the president. In fact, there were no presidents of the nation. There were presidents of the Congress. But it was Madison, Colonel. It was James Madison who wrote me and sent along one of the first drafts of the Constitution. And I declare, I was captivated by it, Henry. You know this, the shortest document of its kind in human history, creating a government to check its own power, Henry. And of the three branches, which branch, the most influential?
Legislative.
Legislative, that elected by the people. Now then, I do not know whether I should say you were in my mind, but knowing how you felt, I did suggest to Mr. Madison that a Bill of Rights was necessary, that all people upon the globe are entitled to a Bill of Rights against any government upon the globe. And I can understand your opinion about Madison, because he wrote me back saying, oh, we do not need a Bill of Rights. No, he said that. We do not need a Bill of Rights. It's all inferred in the Constitution.
Implication.
I wrote him back, Henry, perhaps you know, and said, do you mean to tell me we're going to rest on inference upon such an important subject as the inalienable rights of man? But you know what concerned him, what he was worried about. He was worried that once we begin to enumerate, where do you end? And I reckon there were, over 200 original suggestions for rights. And then the other thing he was concerned about, that once you enumerate them, the argument begins. But Henry, how well you know. Do you mean to tell me if all of the rights are inferred in the Constitution, there is no argument? And Henry, who would always have the last word? Not the people, the government in power. So I dare say, Henry, that we're both alive, perhaps, on that opportunity, the reality that finally came to fruition. We had our Bill of Rights.
Well, gentlemen, the federal government then does go in operation. In spite of Mr. Henry's opposition, the Constitution is ratified and we have a federal government. But Mr. Jefferson, you serve in the federal government in a number of different capacities. Mr. Henry, I believe you did not. Perhaps could you discuss with us your political offices after the government began operating?
I served a total of 5 terms as governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I am first and foremost a Virginian, will be to my dying breath. I was offered numerous positions in the federal system of government after its ultimate ratification. President Washington offered me, for example, Minister of War, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, envoy to Spain, Secretary of State. President Washington, or rather Adams, has just lately offered to me Secretary of State, envoy to Spain, minister to France. There has been a number of men who have urged me to stand for nomination to the presidency in 1796, truly the first election. There was no doubt in anyone's mind who the first president was going to be. And I also very humbly and politely declined nomination to the Senate, even though I would be representing my beloved Virginia. Numerous reasons for this. Mostly, though, it would be unseemly for me to hold high public office in this national government after I had so vigorously opposed it. And ill health, again, has plagued me since the time of the Revolution. I wanted to return to the profession of law and to planting. There's no money in politics, as Mr. Jefferson can attest. And finally, if you could avoid going to Philadelphia, wouldn't you?
Now, Colonel, I want to ask you a question here, and it will provide not only a clarity for me, but I'm certain to so many, many others. I am no less a Virginian. I love my native woods and fields, my former colony of Virginia, even though we were all born British, but our new Commonwealth of Virginia. But if I recall, at the very first Continental Congress in Philadelphia, one which I could not attend, I was ill, but you were there. And if I remember, it is said by many still who remember the occasion that you pronounced yourself boldly, "I am an American." Now, is that any the less? And I say that only because your continued adherence after our Constitution in the process of ratification has the Bill of Rights, your continued adherence to that which is more federalist in its politics. And you claim yourself no politician? Oh, Henry, I'm wondering about that because it is said now you are the greatest supporter of our federal government, the strength of our federal government, in support of General Washington, in support, if you will, of the alliance of a military standing army through all with our nation. All of this, Henry, why? This seems like quite the flipping, as if a fish out of water one way and flopping the other.
Unlike my worthy friend, Mr. Jefferson, who has formed a wretched political faction, which he has the nerve to call Republican, I am a true Republican. That is with a small letter R, not a capital one. I am bound, therefore, to submit to the will of the majority. Despite my superior arguments at the time of the ratification debates in Richmond Town, nonetheless, a slight majority of gentlemen favored Virginia entering into that national system of government. Final vote here was 89 to 79, and Virginia became the 10th state to ratify the Constitution of these United States. At that time, as I proclaimed before the convention, and you wouldn't know, you weren't there, you were in France, but I proclaimed that I would be the most peaceable of all United States citizens thereafter. I would do nothing that would serve to get in the way of the national government being successful. I have thrown my mile in to the General Assembly of Virginia to keep Virginia in the Union, and I am doing so at the specific request, the very personal request of President Washington, who, like me, is very deeply concerned that we are on the verge of disunion.
Dr. Ragosta, adhering to your initial question now some time ago, I was invited and commissioned to be our nation's first Secretary of Foreign Affairs, becoming known within a few weeks the Department of State. But I believe the honor of being recognized as Secretary of Foreign Affairs was because of the 5 delightful years I spent in La Belle France.
Well, gentlemen, you obviously had some disagreements about the operations of the federal government. Perhaps you might comment briefly on your views of Alexander Hamilton's use of the federal government as Secretary of Treasury.
I do not know Alexander Hamilton, though I am given to understand he was one of those who was most vigorously promoting or encouraging my nomination to the presidency of 1796. We've never met. He's a New Yorker. And naturally, as a Southern planter, I was very resistant from the start at his idea of a national bank. We farmers do not trust banks. They exist for one purpose and one alone, and that is to remove the money from the honest farmer, which is the vastest part of our population here in Virginia. And the idea that he would impose a tax to save this national bank upon whiskey. I myself have 3 licenses to distill whiskey. Not that I would complain to the point as many in Western Pennsylvania did, actually taking the field of battle against armed federal troops. I would not go that far. But I do not trust Hamilton, nor will I ever do so.
Dr. Regasta, I certainly have known General Hamilton and for some years. And all I can say is that as a man, he is honest. He is honest. I can trust General Hamilton. And the reason for it, Colonel Henry, is because you know exactly where he stands. He stands at, I would venture to say, yes, the opposite end of the political spectrum, even from you and I. As a man, he is honorable in his business. Honorable in business, Henry. You can trust him in business. And he is most amiable in society. And that, Henry, is certainly you as well. You've always been most adept at pleasantries. But I will tell you that my concern with General Hamilton was the liberty that he had encouraging speculation, stock jobbing, the idea of a monocrat assuming monarchical heirs rather than citizenship. But the point is, we could work together. We could collaborate. Henry, the 2 of us compromised the difference of opinion upon the Assumption Bill and the Residency Act. Granted, it was Madison that we had to influence towards that compromise. But we could work together, Colonel Henry. And we collaborated together to found our nation's Coast Guard. Collaborated together to provide an equilibrium, if you will, a standard of currency, the same value of money in all of our states. He allowed me to create the decimal system. And so I'm rather sorry that you never had the opportunity to meet him. I think the 2 of you would have gotten along, well, famously, if I dare say so myself. You might have stood more in my camp, I will not deny. But I do think, considering that the 2 of us have worked together for so many years, you nonetheless would have been a collaborator.
Well, gentlemen, you both have had careers in which working with those with whom you agree and those whom you disagree has been an important part of your public service, compromise. And perhaps that's an opportunity for several final questions that perhaps are more congenial. We might start with an issue that you referred to as we started. Could you tell us about your interest in music and any instruments that you play?
Oh, my heavens. Yes, Henry, I dare say Dr. Augusta is correct. So many delightful years attendant to the violin. I believe you played the fiddle, did you not?
Indeed, I did not study a lick of music, cannot read a note, unlike my worthy friend, but I seem to have some natural genius to playing the fiddle. I first picked up at the age of 10 only, my uncle's fiddle, Uncle Langlew as we called him. He was quite accomplished upon the fiddle, playing at hymns mostly and country dances. I've found through the years that being an accomplished fiddler as I am, one is never able to dance with one's own wife. Rather, one is stuck playing the music so that others can dance with theirs. But then when I was 12, my father, for my birthday, had presented me with a new horse. A rather rambunctious colt was he, and I fell off of him and broke my collarbone, was laid up in my bedchamber for 6 weeks. And during that period of time, took myself to the flute, which also I seem to have some natural genius for. So I'm rather proficient in those 2 instruments. I've also purchased with great pleasure and happiness a spinet and a harpsichord for my daughters, my wife. Quite a musical household there at the Henry home. And yes, I play the fiddle as opposed to my worthy friend playing violin. The difference in the 2 is that one of them comes with a case.
Oh, Henry, I had heard, do you know, I went to visit your mother at You remember the occasion? Went to visit her there at Winton in Amherst. I had the most pleasant time, and she was telling me about you taking up the flute, and your brother William, I think, was talking about how you become most attentive to the spinet and the harpsichord as well. A musical family, Henry, is it not a great delight? Does it not preserve one's happiness in the midst of all of the vagaries of the boisterous sea of politics?
Indeed, well said, sir. Quite so.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time, but perhaps we could finish with one opportunity. We'd like to hear from you about your wishes for the future of this nation that you helped to found, and what characters and traits you believe that political leaders for the United States need over time.
We have created a bold new experiment here, never before seen in the annals of human history. A republic, a true republic, one whereby the will of the people is the supreme law. I pray that we will always be a virtuous and a moral people, lest we should follow the example of the Republic of Rome, which collapsed miserably in rivers of blood, the countryside all ablaze, and owing to rampant immorality and depravity. The system of government we have established here requires a well-informed and a well-engaged citizenry. And if we should ever become so apathetical or so indifferent as to what those men in government are up to, then we shall certainly and richly deserve the form of government we get. In terms of leaders of our society, they too must be moral and virtuous, even more so to serve as examples to those that they make decisions for. That's ultimately my hope for this bold experiment, that it will be a successful one for many, many generations to come.
Colonel Henry, you've roused me to stand in your honor. Oh, yes, you have indeed, sir. I believe as you do that we are a remarkable people, that we have been able to create not only a republic, but a democratical republic, Henry. It is but common sense. A child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40. Our laws and institutions must grow as we grow as the people. I am dedicated to your recognition of a virtuous government, which is dependent upon, of course, a virtuous people. A people free to carry their communion with their Maker and simply to do good, particularly to one and the other, and to show the rest of the world that we ever remain a remarkable people, because we are composed of so many who have come here to make for a better life. I know you agree with that, Henry, and therefore, despite the fact that we may hold differences of opinion, and that to be welcomed amongst Virginians, but certainly welcomed amongst Americans, knowing that as an American, a difference of opinion must never be a difference of principle. And that I know you ever to be, sir, a man of principle.
Upon that head, sir, we are agreed, old friend.
My pleasure. We thank you, Dr. Ragosta.